to somebody for care and says, when I'm back this way, if you ran into any extra expenses, I'll reimburse you. Right? Remember that story? Well, politicians seem to prefer the parable of the better Samaritan. Okay? Victim on the road to Jericho again. Politician comes by and looks at the victim on the road to Jericho and says, that's terrible, and rushes back to Jerusalem to get a law passed. It says that all travelers on the road to Jerusalem have to pay a tax just in case somebody gets in trouble so we can bail them out. Right? Who should decide whether you can sell taxi services? Hire a worker of another race. Who should decide that? How about who should decide what size your house can be on your own property, your own land? Who should decide whether you want to pay subsidies to farmers? Who should determine the minimum wage at which you will be employed? Who should decide how much money you can donate to a political candidate? And who should decide whether you will purchase a low gas mileage car or not? Whose business is that, in other words? Okay, add them up. How'd you do? Well, let's go on to, whoops. Let's go back to the Bose diagram. See where your two scores are. See which box you fit into. You don't have to tell me. Keep it a secret. My intent here is to define words. That's all. I'm not going to give you any extra credit for being in the green box. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but what about the middle box? Couldn't it be like a pragmatic sort of?
The middle box?
Yeah.
You mean literally the middle, right here?
Yeah, just right dead center. Like
well, this is the Bose diagram. Bose doesn't have a title for that, but yeah, that would be somebody in the squishy middle.
But a pragmatism is somebody that.
Or a pragmatist. Sure. You could use that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you all know where you are on this in the Bose diagram now. Let's take greed. It's another word I want to talk about. Greed. You recognize the three characters up there? This is Michael Douglas, who played Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. This is a senator for some western state that used to be a presidential candidate. And this is Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. Now, why do I single out these three people? Well, you remember what Gordon Gekko said in Wall Street. Remember that famous speech? Greed is good. And it was the intent, of course, of the writer of the script and the director of the movie to use that statement to say that Gordon Gekko had to be an evil man because he was saying greed is good. And then John McCain. While the campaign was still going on, and we had the first clear indication that the banking system was about to collapse, what did John McCain, and by the way, Barack Obama too, say was the fault? The greed of the people on Wall Street, or the greed of the bankers. Right? And then Robert Reich. I watch the History Channel every once in a while. And I just happened one night to come across this story that was being, this narrative being done about the history of ideas, the history of economic ideas. And Robert Reich came on the program, and he introduced Adam Smith and the thinking of Adam Smith. And Robert Reich said Adam Smith was Adam Smith tried to legitimize greed. That the whole edifice of Smithian economics, what we today would call free market economics, is evil because, as Adam Smith himself admitted, it's based on greed. That's what he said. Well, let's look at Mr. Adam Smith. First of all, who is Adam Smith? Right, he wrote 2 books in his famous career. 1759, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. 1776, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations is considered to be the first book in modern economic thought. Well, Smith was very concerned about this word greed, and he wanted to draw a contrast between greed and self-interest. First of all, we're all self-interested. Anybody who doesn't admit that he or she is self-interested is simply lying. Right? It's like gravity. Say you have an airplane, fancy airplane, tries to take off. Every time it tries to take off, it crashes. The aeronautical engineer who designed the plane is asked about this, and he said, "Don't blame me, it's gravity's fault." Right? But the fact is that gravity is a fact of life. It's something that an aeronautical engineer has to deal with. Self-interest is a fact of life. And when trying to evaluate economic systems, the question is, how do you pursue your self-interest? What are the rules under which you can pursue your self-interest? Famous quote of Adam Smith. Paraphrase, this isn't a quote, this is a paraphrase from The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the brewer that we get his drink, but from his regard to his self-interest. And he went on to explain, he takes care of his self-interest by providing something to other people that they're willing to pay for. He takes care of his self-interest by paying attention to the self-interest of other people, giving them something for which they're willing to reward him. Smith's view is that self-interest pursued through voluntary exchange is a very noble thing. Greed is when you try to pursue your self-interest at the expense of someone else, without their consent, using force or fraud or worse. An important distinction, I think. Don't use them interchangeably. That's what I'm trying to get you to see. Greed and self-interest are different. Now let's consider what I call smiley words. These are words that make you warm and fuzzy when you hear them. Like rights, like freedom or liberty, and equality. I mean, when you hear those words, don't you just tingle all over? Huh? Does that make you really feel great? Well, it turns out that there are at least 2 contradictory meanings of each word. Just like liberal and conservative are used by different people in different ways, these words are used by different people in different ways. And when people talk with each other about rights, or about equality, or about freedom, they don't understand why they can't get along. It's because they're not using the words in the same way. They're not giving the words the same meaning. So the classical liberal view, by the way, that's John Locke up there, right? Famous John Locke, who wrote a treatise on civil government, and he is I think it's fair to say that he is perhaps the most famous of the fathers of classical liberal thought, although it goes way back before Locke. goes back to the Romans